Boo! Bulbasaur! Hello, it's Hebion, and in this video I will show you how to make a plushie of each member of the Bulbasaur Evolution line. These plushies are great for beginners. They're in this flat Beanie Baby style, filled with weighted pellets and also a squeaker, but we don't talk about the Demon Soul. These plushies can be made entirely by hand or 50-50 with a machine and a hand needle. And you can download these patterns for free and then follow this video to have your very own. The patterns are linked in the description and are posted publicly on Patreon. Last videos we made all of the Evolutions and Pikachu, which you can follow along with as well. And people have been suggesting Pokémon in the comments section, which I have been factoring into my plushie pattern creation list. To be honest, Charmander floated to the top of people's requests, but I don't have the highly specific Charmeleon Orange yet, so you get Grass Toad. Yep. As we progress through the leaf frogs, they get bigger in vague accordance with their canonical size change, kind of. So our Bulbasaur is a bit more of a lightweight weapon with these stubby legs, the Ivysaur is packing more of a punch, and the Venusaur can only be deployed with a heavy slap at the protest of all those unfortunate enough to be around you. Let us begin. We're starting with Bulbasaur because, they are the best, weirdest little whatever they are. Cut out all of your pattern pieces. There are foldable parts such as the tip of the bulb. Fold them on the line marked and then trace it out as such. And now let's begin with their pattern of scales. I don't know. These ones are more like scales and it seems to progress to more of a skin condition once we hit Venusaur. They may have made this thing smooth in the 3D games and put some half-moon shaped spots on them rather than lumps. But I know in my heart he originally had acne. Anyways, the dots are made with our favourite technique, applique. Applique is layering our colour change over a base fabric in simple terms. So the shapes of your scales, which I freehand onto the body side pieces and less freehand onto the forehead, and then snip all the seam allowance off against our stitches. Bulbasaur's scales are kind of uneven and deserve to be a bit random per Bulbasaur, so don't worry too much. When those are done, align the body halves and sew from the nape of the neck that Bulbasaur doesn't have and down to the butt, which he definitely does have. Then open the body halves and align it with the chest piece. Sew both halves down, leaving a gap in the neck area to turn the plush right side out, and being careful of the feet. Then slice out your seam allowance nice and close, and fill your fat seed amphibian with some seeds. Seeds of the polyfill pellet variety. Or of course, glass beads for doll making, or pony beads, alphabet beads, just beads really. Then stuff a little bit of stuffing into the butt and back to lift it up. This Bulbasaur is tragically steamrolled right now. You can slightly unsteamroll it with this stuffing, but now it's time to do their head. As stated, you should put the scales onto the forehead piece nice and close to where you think the nose will be, and then take the head side pieces and the chin piece and attach them at the point marked in the pattern. Sew down one side at a time until it's all on, and then get the forehead and do the same with that. Every time the forehead will have this fabric overhang at the end of it. This is like a runway to make absolutely sure you won't have a gap at the back. Sewing is rarely perfectly even. The tension at which you hold fabric is highly variable, and it would be bad if one side met perfectly with the end of the chin fabric and one side stopped short. So once your head is done and turned right side out, simply fold this overhang into the head as you stuff it and forget about your sins or whatever. Stuffing these plushies requires utter determination to fit as much stuffing as possible in. Bulbasaur has a fairly wide head, so being bold and brutal with your stuffing practices will fill it out properly. Additionally, always put a firm ball into the nose to keep that stuffed. Time for the face. I give Bulbasaur these big peepers. I like it like that. Sew them on close to the nose. As for the ears, they are slightly more advanced, with these two halves that aren't identical. The back portion of the ear has this snip at the top. This is so that the ear has more volume at the back than the front. Sew up this snip and then sew the front triangle of the ear into the open gap. I do this one side at a time, and when they're ready, I attach them down to their big head. And now, this little freakazoid has this giant seed on their back, and that's the most complicated section. I'm making the patterns of the bulbs using a clay and tape technique where I spend some time sculpting the desired shape, and then cover it in tape and cut it away. I do this for nearly every pattern I make, but this time the clay is nearly dry and the tape keeps sticking to itself as I pull it off, and the summer heat is just terrible, so this was very nearly a rage quit moment. But we persevere. For each one of these bulb segments, there should be 4 of them by the way, draw a nice big seam allowance around it, and as I mentioned at the start, trace out the fold line at the tip of the bulb. The fold line is critical because once we layer them over each other, we're going to sew down the big line at the side, starting from that fold section. We don't attach the bulb tip portions to the next segment, because they'll have a different part hand sewn in there instead. Once you get to the end of the first line, attach your next piece, and once again sew from the end of the fold line down to the base of the bulb. Do this for each of the pieces, until you come full circle and sew the last piece onto the first piece, and then you have a pyramid? Whatever. Now we're sewing up these shorter lines, the dots in each bulb segment. Fold the bulb in half neatly and sew from the edge of the fabric where the line begins down to the base of the bulb. You don't have to go all the way, we will need a gap down there anyways, in order to turn it right side out. Do this to each one of the darts. This changes the shape and pinches it in at the bottom, puffing the bulb out. Once you've done those 4 darts, you should now be able to snip off the seam allowance. Snip it off for all of the darts, the segment seams, and also for the tip of the bulb, which we haven't sewn yet. Get rid of that seam allowance so you can see the triangle shapes, because we're going to hand sew it to complete it. Get the bulb top section, which is a little pointy weewah, and sew it into our bulb tip gap. I'm starting at the point of each these, I guess? I'm not sure what to call them. Anyways, make sure it lines up perfectly, each tip to each point of the insert piece, or it'll be wonky. And now we have to whip our batter until it forms stiff peaks using some rigid felt. This stuff is strong and holds its shape. Cut out a triangle approximating the size of the bulb tip and sew them on. Each tip portion needs a triangle sewn onto it on the inside, so that the bulb tippy bits don't just sink back into the plush. We put a lot of effort into them and we want them to be as defined as possible. Felt is really easy to find, and I would usually consider this specific kind of felt, the one that's stiff and scratchy, to be the opposite of what you want for a plush project, since I usually use felt for the eyes, but it has its uses. You may need to cut a little bit of a hole at the base of the bulb in order to turn it right side out effectively. Stuff to the max with this bulb, to have that round and even shape. I also just like to stuff aggressively, it's what makes plushies look so solid. Now we're ready to attach all their features. Attach the head to the, not a neck, but that area, and sew up the hole we left for stuffing in the body before you do so, and then attach the bulb. After that it's done. For each of these plushies, I'll give them a difficulty rating, with 1 star being the easiest and 5 being the hardest. But keep in mind that these plushies are totally appropriate for beginners, even if some of them might be more frustrating than others. For Bulbasaur, because their bulb is kind of hard, I'm giving them a 4-star rating. The applique is easy on this one, and other than the bulb, they're just a little frog thing. So it's fine. Here they are next to their shiny, which I will say the material to make this was really hard to find. It's 2 very specific pale greens. Bulbasaur's shiny is not perfect. Honestly, it's a little hard to tell, but when they evolve to Ivysaur and Venusaur, it's way more obvious with the gold colours included. So I'll give them a pass for being a mediocre setup for a nice final shiny. Alright, the following plushies are similar in their construction to Bulbasaur, so I'll be covering just the differences in detail. Because it's time for Bulbasaur's awkward teen phase, which somehow has less acne than Venusaur, I will not drop that point. It's Ivysaur! They also have applique scales, although their scales are generally larger than Bulbasaur's. And Ivysaur also has applique inner ear colour changes. Line up and trace out the inner ear colour line and sew your applique fabric down and snip it away to make the little triangle shapes. And now, let's immediately move on to the bulb, which is a bud now. Very nice, but also slightly more complicated. Since Ivysaur's bud is taller and a different shape at the top to Bulbasaur's, the dart actually goes in the other direction. It also has this applique portion for the leaves at the base of the bud, which you should trace out and sew up before doing anything else. Snip all the applique details out on each of the segments, and once that's done, align them with each other similar to the Bulbasaur bulb. So from the bottom of the folded section we traced out, down to the base of the bud. Do this for each piece, attaching them together in a long chain before attaching the first and last bud segment, making them into a ring. And now we're ready for that dart at the top of the bud. So from where the line meets the edge of the fabric all the way to the tip. I say the tip because on the inside edge of the fold line, go all the way to where your whole bud shape ends. This means that there will be 4 tip bits rather than 8. Now slice off all the seam allowance on everything including the top of the bud, which has its own insert piece, similar but not the same as Bulbasaur's bud tip, and the side seams and the darts. Now hand sew the bud tip insert piece in there. Once again, making sure all the tips align with each other perfectly, or as perfectly as I can make them. And it's time once again to break out the stiff felt and make the bud tip portions stand up on their own, since stuffing them is not really an option. The stuffing will slip its way out no matter what you do unless you sew it in, so I think this is the best solution. But you will need a lot of stuffing in this bud unrelated to that. You've got to get that firm, puffed out shape. And we're not quite done, because Ivysaur's bud has unfurled into having these fronds. They're simple enough. Trace them out and sew them up. Slice off the seam allowance and invert them. I like to top stitch a line down the center of them and branching out to a few sides to imitate the veins on a leaf. This way it'll also keep them flatter and stops the fabric bubbling and being mushy. Mushy is not the right word, but whatever. Make the head the same way as the Bulbasaur's, and also the ears the same as Bulbasaur's, except for the fact that they have applique color changes. Then attach all the features to the head, and all the leaves to the body, before then putting on the bulb and sewing it down. Do this in layers to make sure your plushie parts are anchored down to the body base and won't flop around too much. Oh, and attach the head. You can do that in any order though. Once that's on, your Ivysaur is done. Ivysaur is much the same as Bulbasaur, but with some extra steps. It's not quite enough to bump it to a 5, so Ivysaur is a 4 out of 5 stars for difficulty. More applique, more details, and slightly larger, but still, definitely recommend. I mean, I know the mid-stage evolutions get kind of left in the dirt for most Pokémons, but I hope there are enough Ivysaur enjoyers out there who want to make one and not just to complete their set of the whole evolution line. Anyways, now for the final mon, Venusaur, which is obviously a lot more complicated, so where should I start? Actually, since we don't need applique details unless you want to put the lumps on somehow, the body is a lot easier. Just sew it up and stuff it and everything. And that's the easy part. We might as well move on to the bulb, which has now bloomed into a Rafflesia flower. A weird plant choice considering his name is Venusaur. But whatever. Let's begin with the tree trunk. It's going to be a fairly basic cylinder, so cut out the rectangle and circle parts. Oh, except this isn't a basic cylinder. I lied. Before we can sew it up, get the pattern piece to make the golden trim on the plant and lay it over the rectangle piece. Trace out the zigzag pattern twice or as many times as you specifically want, and then, with nothing else on the other side of it, time to do some top stitching in the shapes of those zigzags. This will give the impression of the rough scaly texture it has in the art. When doing top stitching like this, go over every corner multiple times to secure the stitches. Do this when sewing everything, but especially this, because if the thread gets pulled even slightly, it will deform and pinch the surface we just sewed and make the final product lumpy. Now we can cylinderize this thing, which if you passed grade 3, I'm sure you can do. Sew down the raw edge and then pick an end to add our circle piece, and boom, cylinder with an open end. I mean, that's technically something else with a far more complex topology. Whatever, stuff it and get ready for the flower portion. Venusaur may not have applique spots on the body, but they do have spots somewhere, and they have moved to the flower petals. I freehand these so they're a bit uneven, putting down however many I want. We're going to have to applique all of these and snip off the seam allowance before we sew the two halves of petal together. The underside doesn't need spots, thankfully. You're also going to have to do it 6 times since there's 6 petals, which doesn't sound like that many, but it really is. Once you have them all ready and turned the right way out, it's time for yet more stiff felt. otherwise the petals would flop listlessly to either side. You can also use wire or paddle pop sticks or whatever you might like to hold them up. But I use felt since it's easiest to sew through when attaching them down, but it's not easier to jam them inside, I feel. Once they're all stiff and ready, pin them down to the top of your tree trunk bit and sew them all in securely. We're not quite done with the flower yet, there's even more. It has this yellow gold ring around the inside, which we make using that zigzag pattern piece, which we also traced for the top stitches on the trunk. Once it's sewn up, attach it to the top of the flower in a ring. Securing the petals beforehand is crucial here, as getting the needle through 6 layers, one of which includes a stiff felt, would be a hard ask for the approximately 50 plus stitches you'll have to do on this ring alone. Okay, interjection. I don't know how I never noticed this, but the Venusaur has a gender difference. The female's thingy has this extra little bud on it. Actually, I totally do know how I missed this because it is irrelevant. I guess we've got male Venusaurs, whatever. Like Ivysaur, Venusaur has fronds coming from their back, which we shall make now before moving on to their head, which is the standard method of construction, although for the facial features, Venusaur's ears also have an applique color change segment in the center, like Ivysaur, as well as eyelids. There's a foldable portion on the eye pattern which indicates the eyelid part. I sew it over the whole eye rather than cut the eye itself into a half moon shape because I think it gives it volume and makes the lidded eyes more obvious. But to each their own. Once it's all done, the eyes and the ears, it's time to attach the body parts. Starting with the head because why not, and then the fronds, and then the big flower thingy, which is really annoying and hard to put down. What do you know? And then they're done. Phew. As a final stage evolution, they have just so many details. They're also larger than the other ones, and that increases the time spent hand sewing and inevitably stabbing your fingers and untangling snags in the thread. So they're an easy 5 out of 5 stars for difficulty. At least you know what you're signing up for. I still think it's fun, and as I said before, I actually like their shiny quite a lot. I think every shiny has its haters, even ones that are super good. I put this one into the category of thoughtful shinies. Not necessarily the best, but some shinies feel randomly generated and some of them were picked with a specific purpose in mind or to evoke a particular theme. And the colour scheme of pale greens, golds and yellows works really well and is different from the blue, green, pink of Venusaur's regular form. So there, still mad about Leafeon's trash shiny. Anyways, now all the beasts are together. Have fun making these. As said, you can download the patterns for free and go crazy. If you're one of the yellow-green shiny haters, you can make your own version. The materials I used are 5mm pile minky, soft felt and hard acrylic felt, as well as hobby stuffing and polyfill pellets, and a squeaker. But I would also recommend polar fleece as a material choice because it's cheaper and still nice. Thank you for watching! And shout out to my Patreon members who give me cash monies to keep going with the editing and the sewing and the making more free patterns for you guys to use. It means a lot to me and I hope you all have a great day or night and enjoy your new cuddly little pal. If you're bold enough to make a Venusaur, best of luck. But they are a good weapon.